Not many know of the mass killings of 1988.
A crime against humanity began in Iran.
The delegation had but one question. On the answer, their life would depend.
Tens of thousands of people who were subjected to extrajudicial killings
suddenly disappeared, simply for their political opinions.
Shot by firing squad.
30,000 political prisoners in Iran were massacred.
Their bodies were doused with disinfectant and buried by night in mass graves.
With hands and faces sticking out from the dirt.
And there has been no justice for the victims and their families.
Repression and terrorism are part of its DNA.
Within months after the 1979 revolution, Ruhollah Khomeini labeled anyone challenging his rule as corrupt and started an agenda to eliminate all political dissidents.
اگر ما از اول قلم تمام مطبوعات را شکسته بودیم و چوب‌های دار را در میدان‌های بزرگ برپا کرده بودیم و مفسدین و فاسدین را درو کرده بودیم، این زحمت‌ها پیش نمی آمد. اگر ما انقلابی بودیم اجازه نمی دادیم اینها اظهار وجود کنند. تمام احزاب را ممنوع اعلام می کردیم. تمام جبهه ها را ممنوع اعلام می کردیم. یک حزب و اون حزب الله.
In late July 1988, several political activists held in prisons across Iran suddenly disappeared. They were young men and women, some of whom had been arrested years ago in their teens and imprisoned simply for their political opinions and peaceful activities such as distributing opposition leaflets and attending demonstrations. Most of them were supporters of the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran, or PMOI, or MEK.
In a tempest of savagery that has not been surpassed since the end of the Second World War, the fascist theocracy began the systematic execution of political prisoners. Within months, they had hanged over 30,000 men and women, mostly members and supporters of the People's Mujahedin of Iran, the PMOI, MEK, the main democratic opposition to the mullahs.
July 1988, Iran's supreme leader, Khomeini, issued a fatwa. And he issued a fatwa ordering the execution of political prisoners, members, sympathizers of the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran.
Khomeini labeled the MEK as hypocrites and decreed,
if the person at any stage of the judicial process maintains his or her support for the PMOI, the sentence is execution. Annihilate the enemies of Islam immediately.
Iran's genocide started, setting Iran's roses on fire.
As I was rereading Khomeini's decree to execute MEK supporters in 1988, I was once again shocked by the sheer madness of it all. I hope he writes to his subordinates that with your revolutionary rage and vengeance, you will achieve the satisfaction of the Almighty God. He calls not to hesitate, nor show any doubt, or be concerned with details. He requires from his executioners to be most ferocious. This is the expression of an insane and cruel mind, demanding from his subordinates in the name of God to hate and kill, to be violent and act as ferocious animals, ordering to appointed officials to violate their own laws without hesitation, to embrace evil without doubt, and to bear disdain for details, pushing his proxies to dive into a dehumanizing spiral of terror and sadistic behavior. That is the essence of this regime.
In his decree, Khomeini ordered the formation of 3-member panels known as death commissions. Each panel included a religious judge, prosecutor, and a representative from the Ministry of Intelligence. Death commissions were formed in at least 96 cities to put an end to MEK in Iran. Khomeini's most ardent loyalists were appointed to the commission. They included current President Ebrahim Raisi, who in 1988 was Tehran's deputy prosecutor and ordered the execution of MEK prisoners. We will hear more about him later in this video. Renowned legal expert and former UN appeal judge at the Special Court for Sierra Leone described the case in November 2016.
The delegation had but one question for these young men and women, most of them detained since 1981, merely for taking part in street protests or possession of political reading material. And although they didn't know it, on the answer, their life would depend. Those who, by that answer, evinced any continuing affiliation with the MEK were blindfolded and ordered to join a conga line that led straight to the gallows. Their bodies were doused with disinfectant, packed in refrigerated trucks, and buried by night in mass graves.
منافق محارب حکمش اعدامه. این فتوای هم امام بود هم حکمش هم همه علما و مراجع. یکی از مراجع حتی خود آیت الله منتظری هم که میگن خود ایشون هم حکمش همینه. این که درش بحثی نبود. قرار شد باز یه گروهی 3 نفره از وزارت و یعنی از آدمایی که قاضی بودند و واردند و داستان اینا نظارت کنن باز یک کسی اگر قابل عفو و میشه اعدام نشه. خب این گروه کارش این بود، کارش حکم اعدام که نبود. یعنی میگن
فرض بر این حکم، ببخشید میخوام بدونم درست فهمیدم یا نه، فرض بر کلا اعدام بود. این گروه بنا بر این بودش که یک سری اعدام نکنن،
بنا بود که احتیاط کنن، یعنی باز مراجعه کنن ببینن واقعا با طرف صحبت کنن، ببینن باز سر موضع هست یا نیست. سر موضع اسمش میگفتن سر موضع تا سر موضع
ملاک سر موضع بودن چی بودن؟
سر موضع بود که من سازمان قبول دارم شما رو هم قبول ندارم، رها هم بشم علیه شما میجنگم.
حتی این منافقین اونایشون که سر موضع اند، امام تأکید میکرد اونایشون که سر موضع اند فرمود با اینا برخورد کنید. اونایشون که سر موضع اند از موضعشون برنگشتند با اینا برخورد کنید. این فرمایش امام بود به ما و همونجور که امام نظرشون بود ما اقدام میکردیم. اونایی هم که قضاتی که سر کار بودن قانون دستشون بود، نظر امام، رأی امام تو دستشون بود و بر طبق او اگر بنا بود اعدام میدید.
شما وارد دادگاه میشدی، از شما فقط اسم و مشخصات میپرسیدن، بعد اتهام، بیان کلمه اتهام یعنی مجاهد گفتن خودش تعیین تکلیف بود و بعد زندانی رو از زندان از توی دادگاه خارج میکردن و وقتی که زندانی از دادگاه میومد بیرون یک کلمه داشتن به اسم این که این باید بره گوهردشت و کسی که وقتی کلمه گوهردشت بیان میشد منظورش اعدام بود.
از زیر چشمن دیدم که جلوی سن انبوه.
On this day, I was witnessing new phenomena where all the MEK were standing tall and defending their ideals. Death was nothing to them, and they made a mockery of death. I was also gaining my spirit, until they took several people. Then the guard who had brought me called me and took me into the death hall. I did peep from my blindfold and saw many corpses in front of a stage there. I was kept some distance away from the stage, then uncovered my blindfold. I fainted. I said to myself, God, what is going on here? I saw that 12 MEK each were standing on a chair with a rope around their necks. While I was watching, the yelling of "Death to Khomeini," "Long live Rajavi," "Long live freedom," overwhelmed the area. I witnessed that next to them were other bodies of the martyrs whose feet were grabbed by the guards and dragged out of the hall. When they were chanting slogans, the guards were bewildered. One of them, named Nasserian, turned to Lashkari and Hamid Nouri and the guards shouting at them, "Why are you standing there? They are evil. They are hypocrites." After saying these words, he went towards those standing on the chairs with Nouri and Davud Lashkari and started kicking at the chairs under their feet. They kicked, and the prisoners were dropped hanging from the rope. It was at this point that I could no longer bear what I was witnessing. I did not understand anything anymore and fainted. After a while, I sensed that a guard was pouring some water on me. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the bodies were lingering on the ropes. They had already passed away. The guard blindfolded me and brought me back to the same place where I was. After the executions, we were brought back to Ward 13. We saw that a small number of MEK prisoners had remained. We were next in line to be executed. Nasserian and this very person, Hamid Nouri, came to Ward 13 and threatened us to say that the executions are still going on. And should you continue to carry on supporting the organization, don't imagine that we will not execute.
In February 2018, a civil society hearing was held into the 1988 massacre in Geneva.
How were the executions carried out? Well, amnesty commissions were what they were called, but they very quickly became known as death commissions. And their name is chillingly telling. The hearings, such as they were, lasted, it seems from the evidence, around 2 or 3 minutes. And there's been many reports and much evidence of the questions that people were asked before these hearings. Essentially, they included a necessity to renounce loyalty to the Mojahedin.
There is a lot of speculation about the number of victims. There are those who try to minimize, and they refer to a figure like 7,000 victims. But there are also those who speak about 20,000 victims. The figure of 30,000 also is given, and there are those who refer to 120,000 victims. So, as far as the report is concerned, the exact figure is irrelevant. What is relevant is that there is a crime against humanity that has taken place between July 1988 and December 1988. That is a crime against humanity by all standards.
قبل از اینکه ما بفهمیم چیه، ملاقات قطع شد. از 28 تیر ماه هواخوری قطع شد، مطبوعات روزنامه نمیدادن.
ما 135 نفر موندیم از چندین هزار نفر زندانی که در آنجا بودن. 135 نفر زنده موندیم.
5 اتاق دربسته هیچ کدوم زنده نمونده، هیچ کدوم. ما فقط 1 نفرشون زنده مونده بود. همه اینها رو اعدام کردن. طبقه دوم هم همینطور، یک سری از بچه‌ها نبودن. طبقه سوم هم یک سری بچه‌ها رو اعدام کردن که مجموعاً حاصلش این شد که 3 طبقه رو کردن 1 طبقه.
For months, victims' families desperately sought information about their loved ones. They heard nothing but lies from the authorities. Ultimately, they began to learn the devastating truth. Their loved ones had been secretly executed and buried in mass graves.
میخوام قبر بچه‌ام پیدا کنم. میخوام ببینم گور بچه‌ام کجا هستن که اگه یه روز یک از زنده ماندم رفتم ایران، برم خودم بنازم رو قبر بچه‌ام. برم بر بچه‌ام گریه نکنم. برم سینه تو خودم بنازم رو قبر بچه‌ام.
It is perhaps the cruelest of all never to tell parents and children where their loved one is buried. But you have, in the current regime in Iran, the cruelest group of men, for the most part, in the world, and that the rights of individuals, even of grieving families, mean nothing to them.
Trucks were loaded with hundreds of bodies of corpses of people that were then dumped into mass graves. The horror of the scene, and this is a picture that you can access, is that there were so many dead people into these mass graves that the dirt they poured in to try to cover the bodies was not enough. And they left the mass graves with hands and faces sticking out from the dirt as a vivid proof of the brutality and the absolute inhumanity of what was happening at that moment.
New evidence obtained from satellite imagery shows that the Iranian authorities are deliberately destroying suspected or confirmed mass grave sites associated with the 1988 massacre. Footages from MEK sources inside Iran confirm the destruction of the mass graves as evidence of this genocide. In 2016, an audio file of a secret meeting that was held at the height of the mass killing emerged. In the recording from August 1988, members of the Tehran Death Commission can be heard discussing the operation with Khomeini's heir apparent. Khomeini's successor, Hossein Ali Montazeri, can be heard criticizing members of the Death Commission, including Ebrahim Raisi, for carrying out the massacre. Montazeri's criticism ended with his dismissal by Khomeini as the country's next supreme leader.
بیان اونجا ملاقات خط رو نشدم هم شدیم از قصابی کنیم اونجا چطور میرونیم اونجا این هم چطور هیچ تا دنیای همچه کاری هست و شخص احمد آقا پسر خمینی هم از 3-4 سال قبل مجاهد از روزنامه خونشو از مدرد خونشو از اعلامی خونش همه باید اعلام شد. به نظر من بزرگترین جنایت به جمهوری اسلامی شده و در تاریخ ما رو محکوم میکنه به دست شما انجام شده و شما رو در آینده جزء جنایتکاران تو تاریخ می‌نویسن.
The tape clearly demonstrates that this was no mistake. The massacre was planned over several years. It also demonstrates the widespread involvement of various factions within the regime.
This crime against humanity has drawn international attention.
July 19th marks the anniversary of the start of Iran's so-called death commissions. On the orders of Ayatollah Khomeini, these commissions reportedly forcibly disappeared and extrajudicially executed thousands of political dissident prisoners. The current head of the Iranian judiciary and current Minister of Justice have both been identified as former members of these death commissions. The Iranian judiciary is widely perceived to lack independence and fair trial guarantees, and the revolutionary courts are particularly egregious in ordering violations of human rights. All Iranian officials who commit human rights violations or abuses should be held accountable. The United States calls on the international community to conduct independent investigations and to provide accountability and justice for the victims of these horrendous violations of human rights organized by the Iranian regime.
Significant number of petitions, communications, and documentation related to the reported executions of thousands of political prisoners, men, women, and teenagers in 1998 speaks a deep and unremitting pain that must be surely addressed. These killings themselves have been acknowledged by some at the highest levels of the states. I therefore reiterate my call upon the government to ensure that a thorough and independent investigation in these events is carried out.
In September 2020, 7 UN special rapporteurs wrote a letter to Iranian authorities decrying the 1988 massacre. They reported that between July and September 1988, Iranian authorities forcibly disappeared and extrajudicially executed thousands of imprisoned political dissidents affiliated with political opposition groups in 32 cities in secret and discarded their bodies mostly in unmarked mass graves. They called on the international community to take action to investigate the case. In May 2021, more than 150 former UN officials and renowned international human rights and legal experts wrote to UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, calling for an international commission of inquiry into the 1988 massacre. Signatories to the open letter include former UN High Commissioner and Irish President Mary Robinson, a former UN Deputy Secretary General, 28 former UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights, and the chairs of previous UN commissions of inquiry into human rights abuses in Eritrea and North Korea. In August 2021, in his report to the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Javaid Rehman, Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Iran, expressed concern about the regime's attempts to destroy evidence of the 1988 massacre. He also underlined how the regime authorities involved in human rights violations enjoy systematic impunity. But 3 decades on, the perpetrators remain in high positions of power, and they have faced no accountability for their crimes. According to Amnesty International, the secrecy surrounding how the victims were killed and where they were buried means that they are still forcibly disappeared. The torture of their families is ongoing. These crimes are so serious that they constitute crimes against humanity.
There are two crimes that have happened. One is executions, extrajudicial executions without proper trials and so on. But there's another crime which is called enforced mass disappearance, right? And with the enforced disappearance, that crime is still alive in the sense that these people have disappeared. There has been no accounting for them. So long as government does not account to the families, to the society and to the world of the people that they murdered, it means that the crime is still alive and still requiring of investigation.
The 1988 massacre is not an incident from the past. The perpetrators enjoy impunity at the highest levels of the government and judiciary.
Members of the death commissions are currently holding judicial offices, including the post of Supreme Court judges, 2 members of parliament, 7 members of the Assembly of Experts, and 2 members of the Expediency Council are also among the members of the death commissions. Additionally, some of Iran's largest financial and trade institutions are run and controlled by the perpetrators, and the current Minister of Justice, as well as 3 previous Ministers of Justice, all served on the death commissions. Naturally, also Iran's current supreme leader, who was president in 1988, was directly involved in the massacre. You can clearly see how participation in this crime against humanity became a career-making moment for many Iranian officials. Complicity became not something to be ashamed of, but a selection criteria for higher office, and impunity has thus become institutionalized in the country. The perpetrators now permeate every Iranian authority with a hand in the current ongoing abuses. When officials are, so to speak, during their career trained in mass murder of dissidents, mass murder is how they will respond to new protests.
The regime's human rights abuses are well documented and sadly continue today as a matter of state policy because of the failure of the international community, including Western democracies, to hold the regime to account.
In July 2019, then Minister of Justice and current advisor to the Chief of the Judiciary, Mustafa Pourmohammadi, who was a member of the Death Commission in 1988, claimed that the elimination of the MEK must continue based on Khomeini's fatwa.
حالا یک مسئله که در واقع به جمهوری اسلامی خیلی تهمت شدید و بزرگی زده میشه و همچنان هم ادامه داره و معمولا رسانه‌های خارجی دنبال میکنن، موضوع در واقع نفاقه، برخورد جمهوری اسلامی با نفاق هستش که اوجش در سال 67 بعد از مرصاد هست. خب شما هم اطلاعات خارجی بودید، هم در اون ماجرای در واقع در این ماجرا حضور داشتید. حالا خودتون توضیح بدید که به چه نحوی بوده این شبهه رو در واقع
ما با منافقین الان حسابمون تصفیه نکردیم. ما این حرفا رو بعد از تصفیه حساب خواهیم زد. شوخی هم نداریم. ما هنوز باید اینا بیان پاسخ جنایت‌هاشون، خیانت‌هاشون. منافقین همشون جنایتکارن، همشون تو دادگاه محاکمه میشن، همشون طبق تمام قوانین دنیا آدم کشتن، جنگ کردن، به اشد مجازات باید محکوم بشن. ما هنوز تصفیه حساب نکردیم و وقت این حرفا نیست. وقت تصفیه حساب الان. امروز هم منافقین خائن‌ترین دشمن این ملتن و امروز باید اینا بیاد جواب بدن و بعد پای میز محاکمه بیان، به حساب تک تکشون هم باید برسیم.
Meanwhile, the former intelligence minister explicitly said that Khomeini's fatwa for the execution of MEK members was not just for the span of the 1988 massacre.
در رابطه با منافقین و تمام گروه‌هایی که محارب هستند، حکم اعدامه.
به جهت اینکه مصداق بقیه محسوب میشن.
آره. اصلا امام فرموده اینا همه مراجع این نظرشون هست. اون وقت هم دعوا بود اصلا که آقای موسوی که داستان کل انقلاب بود اصلا محاکمه نمیخوان و به همین دلیل
موسوی تبریزی
اصلا محاکمه نمیخوان. چیزی که داره با ما میجنگی که معنا نداره ما محاکمه بکنیم. یه عده دیگه از آقایون معتقد بودن که حالا در هر صورت این ارزم به حضورتون که اونایی که دستگیر میشن محاکمه بشن. مثلا اگه شبهه‌ای شد کسی رو کشته یا نکشته شبهه هست
اینو نکشتن بذاره
بذاره. ولی در مورد منافقینشون میگه به اصل شما اینها، من اینا رو میشناسم، اینا
اشد مجازات برسون،
این اشد مجازات نه دستتون در نرن و اینا هم حکمشون همیشه اعدام. این دیگه اصلا حکم ولایی ایشون بود، چه قبل این جریان 67 چه بعد.
The perpetrators of the 1988 massacre have never been held accountable. Today, they are continuing the clampdown on dissent with impunity. That includes the arrest, torture, and execution of MEK supporters and anti-regime protesters. On June 19, 2021, one of the main perpetrators of the 1988 massacre and a member of the Tehran Death Commission, Ebrahim Raisi, was appointed as the regime's president. Amnesty International Secretary General Agnes Callamard has said that Ebrahim Raisi should be investigated for crimes against humanity instead of taking up the presidency. She said that Ebrahim Raisi has risen to the presidency instead of being investigated for the crimes against humanity of murder, enforced disappearance, and torture is a grim reminder that impunity reigns supreme in Iran. In 2018, Amnesty International documented how Ebrahim Raisi had been a member of the Death Commission, which forcibly disappeared and extrajudicially executed in secret thousands of political dissidents in Evin and Gohardasht prisons near Tehran in 1988.
30,000 political prisoners were murdered in Iran that year, 33 years later, and there has been no justice for the victims and their families. There has been no accountability for Ayatollah Khomeini's order or for those who carried them out. A long list that includes the new president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. And that such a monstrous figure was selected is a message from the regime to Iranians and the world. We have committed terrible atrocities in the past, and we will not hesitate to commit more.
So while the regime is insisting on the legacy of the 1988 massacre, what should be done next?
We know very well that Iran, the Mullah regime, will not investigate. And it will be naive to believe that the mullahs will investigate themselves.
Iranian regime must be held accountable for human rights violations, and the international community must be more firm on this. I would also like to address the families of the 30,000 political prisoners who perished during the 1988 massacre and restate my support to their calls for justice and accountability through the formation of the United Nations Commission of the Inquiry into the 1988 massacre. For nearly 33 years, the world had forgotten about the victims of the massacre. This should change. The United Nations Commission on Inquiry is of crucial importance to shed light over the horrible 1988 massacre. Families of the victims see the commission of the inquiry so that they could finally obtain justice and closure. I therefore once again clearly and loudly support the call of the UN investigator on human rights in Iran, who has called for an independent inquiry into allegations of state-ordered executions of thousands of political prisoners and the role played by the president-elect as Tehran deputy prosecutor.
30 years ago, Raisi was in charge of the Ayatollah's death squads, and he's now the president of that country. A brutal mass murderer, responsible in 1988 for the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners. His selection as president is clearly intended to quash internal dissent and intimidate the people of Iran into remaining silent. But we must never remain silent in the face of evil. Many people attending today know well just how evil Raisi is. Many of you gathered here and many of you looking on lost loved ones by Raisi's hand. His crimes must not go unpunished. Ebrahim Raisi must be removed from office by the people of Iran, and he must be prosecuted for crimes against humanity and genocide.
In 1988, Raisi was a member of the Death Committee that oversaw the execution and mass murder of over 30,000 political prisoners across Iran. The victims were buried in mass graves, and their families know nothing about their fate. They were executed for their belief in democracy, and the overwhelming majority of them were members and supporters of the principal MEK. In his first post-election news conference, Raisi, who is known as the henchman of 1988 by the Iranian people, said he was proud of committing these crimes against humanity and that he should be commended for protecting the regime. It is somewhat inconceivable that the West does not condemn this international criminal. What more does he need to do to deserve condemnation from democratic countries? Already, leading human rights institutions and top UN human rights experts have called for an impartial investigation into Raisi's role in the 1988 massacre. Why the silence? It is time to end the culture of impunity for Tehran's mass murderers. Enough is enough. It is disgraceful and shameful that Tehran continues to enjoy impunity some 30 years after the 1988 massacre and the massacre of at least 1,500 protesters in November of 2019.
Reference has already been made to the 1988 massacre, and that cannot be forgotten or forgiven or shoved under the carpet. What is required is that amnesty's call be honoured, that there should be an investigation of Ebrahim Raisi for crimes against humanity. That man has much for which to answer, and he is the very embodiment of the bloodthirsty tyrant.
In her speech in 2021, Maryam Rajavi, the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, stated,
"On behalf of the Iranian people and resistance, I call on the United Nations and the international community to recognize the 1988 massacre in Iran as genocide and a crime against humanity. The UN Security Council should take immediate action to arrange for the international trial of the leaders of the regime, especially Khomeini, Raisi, and its judiciary chief, Ejei, for committing genocide and crimes against humanity. Since 1988, when it first exposed this massacre, the Iranian resistance has started a relentless campaign to call for justice. The call for justice movement, enjoying widespread international support of parliaments of several countries, as well as well-known humanitarian organizations, will continue until the perpetrators of this horrible crime are put on trial and Iran is free.
And really, finally, the question which must be relevant here is what is the purpose of the UN if it is not to investigate the 1988 massacre? It is time that international law regains its teeth, its strength, and that an independent inquiry is set up to investigate this widespread, systematic, inhumane, barbaric, medieval crime against humanity. Thank you.